I would like a warm welcome for Dr. J. Kalbas. Hope I didn't pronounce that wrong. Welcome to Wichita.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
What a pleasure, first of all, to share some time with you all. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. As Chairman Delperdang was saying, my background, I'm very much an oil and gas guy. I come from the oil and gas industry. And I think it was day 3 that on the job here in Kansas that my boss rang me up and he said, "Hey, you're a development guy. I want you to do hydrogen." Okay. So I said, "Well, tell me more." And he said, "Well, I want you to be a part of the largest federal grant ever to be granted, certainly in the energy space, but across spaces." So I said, "Okay." And so I'm Googling what hydrogen is, at the same time that I'm talking to him. So, in all seriousness, though, the hydrogen piece is something that the world is going to. It's the next energy development pathway. The world is doing that, and the United States needs to be a leader in that. And I think Kansas can be a leader and central in what we're doing in the United States' development. There's no reason. We have all the assets, and in fact, I would say our assets are unique among the nation. The national infrastructure. Before I get into hydrogen, I want to kind of step back and I want to think a little bit about energy systems. And I've got a bunch of slides to talk to you about. And I want to kind of take you back to the scale and the importance of the global energy system. And that's going to then lead us into what's going on in the nation. And then that'll lead us into to what's going on in Kansas and why we're uniquely qualified, I would say. And I'm going to keep an eye on my time so that I have time for questions and don't get too far into the slides. So first, a quick anecdote. I took my family to Calgary, Alberta last year. I was stationed in Calgary with Exxon for about 5 years and was going back and forth to northern Alberta to work on the oil sands and going out to Newfoundland to develop the offshore resources that ExxonMobil and others have in those waters. My family went to Calgary last week, and as we're landing, we land, we get up to the gate, and the captain came on and talked about the fact that there was a power outage, a transformer blew in the air side, and we were going to be delayed getting off the plane. So we sat there for about 2 hours, and they finally got us off the plane and got us in through customs. And then we sat at the baggage terminal for another 5 hours. And this was all because of literally a temporary, about a half an hour blip in the power system in the airport, in the international terminal. Little blips in our energy system that are seemingly small have massive implications. In this case, it was several $1 million for WestJet and for Air Canada and United. It was a big deal, certainly to us. And again, we're in the best developed energy system in the world. Energy growth and energy systems are really driven by the population, by the human population. The United States and the OECD nations, so effectively the developed world, is by far the largest energy user, and actually our energy portfolio is diminishing. And a lot of that comes from, or our energy need, I should say, is starting to decrease. And the reason for that portfolio decreases really comes from efficiency. We're getting far more efficient in how we're using energy, and I'll show some slides about this in a little bit. But as you can see on this graph, the portfolio differs dramatically as you go around the world. China, significant increases in their energy portfolio. Latin America, they use less, they have less availability, they're on a growth pathway. India and Africa have by far the least access in the world to energy systems. And this leads to some catastrophic implications. One of my leaders at ExxonMobil, whom I very much appreciated her perspectives, told a story about her grandmother who moved from northern Nigeria to the capital, Lagos, mainly because of access to energy there. Access to energy for her meant that she could spend less time going and gathering water, less time going and gathering food, and instead she could go to school. And that, of course, led to her granddaughter being a senior most executive at ExxonMobil Corporation and a global leader. This is a photograph that a friend of mine, Scott Tinker, who's actually my position in Texas, so he's the Texas state geologist and an energy industry advocate. This is a picture that he took on one of his tours through, in this case, this is Eastern Africa. This is a school that's also a church. You can see a couple of light bulbs there that are intermittently lit. But this is abject poverty. And that abject poverty, also a photograph from Scott, leads to quite catastrophic implications for human health, catastrophic implications for ecology. This is just basically a stream where people get their water. These are little girls in the background who are crossing the stream to go to school, and that's their pathway to get to their school. These were impactful photographs to me. And that's the kind of work these are the kinds of photographs that inspired me to get involved in projects like this. So this is a large gravity-based structure that we built in Newfoundland. It's being towed out by 5 massive seagoing tugs to go sit out a little bit north of where the Titanic sank, actually. So this is out in the Grand Banks. And this is a producing platform called Hebron. This is a project that I had a chance to go and see and work on in northern Alberta. So these are the oil sands. This is the scale of what it takes to bring energy to the market. And then I'm most proud of this. These are some wells that I drilled in North Dakota. These are long-reach horizontal wells. These wells go down about 2 miles, and then they go out about 3 miles. They're steered in a formation so that we can go and tap into unconventional resources and produce that oil and gas back to the surface. This is why, linked with poverty around the world, energy poverty, this is why I got into this business. So back to this description and what's going on. This is a graph that was provided from my alma mater. This is ExxonMobil's Outlook for Energy. Every year they do an outlook that looks, in this case, out to about 2050. All oil companies do this. All major oil companies do this. And it's their way of trying to figure out what's population doing, what are energy systems doing, and how are we moving. And what this shows is below the line, it shows the energy demand growth. So negative energy demand growth in North America, Europe, and the OECD nations. That's efficiency again. Above the line is everyone who's growing. And so this is China, this is India, this is Africa, this is other OECD nations. And again, to make the point, this doesn't mean that their economies are growing at scale, and it doesn't mean that our economy is not growing precipitously. What this means is that their energy demand is growing precipitously. So the takeaways from these notions, our population's going from roughly 7.8 billion today to a staggering 9.7 billion in 2050. Yeah, 9.7 billion people. More than half of that population growth is in Africa and in the Middle East. Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria, will be, I think, the largest city in 2040, something like that, if memory serves. Only 3% of that growth is in the OECD nations. Efficiency gains, they help reduce energy demand for OECD nations. So that's a good thing. Again, our efficiency is improving. Middle class growth, access to middle class systems is largely driven by energy, and it's also a demand on energy. Folks want to be able to drive cars. They want to be able to heat and cool their homes. They need access to the energy necessary for the internet and computing systems. There's an overall 15% rise in energy need by 2050. And another way to look at that is with a graph like this. So this is from BP. And this shows kind of where we are today. This is in the units on the y-axis. This is exajoules. It just means a whole bunch of energy. I'll use exajoules. I'll use kilowatts, kilowatt hours, megawatts, gigawatts, as well as BTUs, which are British thermal units. Anyway, staggering graph when you look at 1965 to where we are today, to where we're going in 2050, 2055. It's interesting, in my view, to look at this as a percentage of growth now, or as percentage of change. So again, in the y-axis now, it's the same data, but you're looking at it as 100% of our energy portfolio, and it's broken into coal on the bottom, oil and natural gas in green and red, and then nuclear, hydroelectric, wind. They're all important for our portfolio. This is COVID. That blew me away when I realized that. That's COVID. So this world calamity, this world change, and this shock to our system for a year to 2 years, that's what it looks like on an energy demand perspective. And that staggers me when I think about the number of people that weren't traveling during that time. It's a blip on the radar as far as our total energy demand and total energy systems. And our total energy demand, again, this is in units of quadrillion BTU. They're unimaginably large numbers for all of us. But it's really broken into commercial transportation and light duty transportation. Notice that commercial transportation, this green line, the lower green line, is the real significant growth vector here. So it's going to go up. Light duty vehicle transportation in this analysis is expected to diminish some, the energy requirement. Electrical generation, electricity generation. Notice the significant growth vector on that from where we are today to where we're going in 2050. So electrical energy generation from a whole bunch of different sources, and I'll show you perspectives on this in a little while. That's going to be growth globally by, again, access of the middle class to energy systems. It's also our increasing demand on our electrical fleet, and I'll show you what that means. Industrial use, so that's energy for producing all the textiles, all the materials that we do, including heavy manufacturing, things like metals, steels, etc. And then residential and commercial, of course, stays about the same. This is our boat. So this is the Payara Prosperity Floating Production Storage and Offloading Vessel. This is an FPSO. It's an unbelievably large vessel. So you can see the crew quarters at the back. What this vessel does is it allows us to install subsea infrastructure on the seafloor, bring oil and gas from particular wells that are distributed out across a field, bring that oil and natural gas back to subsea manifolds, and then bring through a pipeline system that actually lays on the seafloor, brings that oil and gas back up to the surface. And this is what it looks like when we are processing it at the surface. For perspective, again, crew quarters back here, this is the flare boom. So that's the vent that we use as a safety precaution to vent natural gas into the atmosphere to make sure that we don't blow up the vessel. Very, very, yeah, it's a good deal. Really significant size. That is one vessel in a range of 6 vessels that when I was at ExxonMobil that we were in the business of building. And that one vessel and the subsea infrastructure cost us somewhere on the order of $10 to $12 billion for one field. And at the time that I was leaving ExxonMobil, we were working on plans for as many as 6 of those. So $50-60 billion to develop the resources of Guyana. It's by far the most exciting exploratory and development campaign that the world has seen in decades. And by far the largest that we've ever seen in the offshore. What this equates to is oil production that looks something like this, and I liked this visual aid. And it shows global oil production, so we use about 100 million barrels per day globally. By far, the U.S. is the single largest oil and gas producer. We're followed by Saudi Arabia and by Russia. But we're producing about 16 million barrels per day as U.S. producers. This just shows statistics for OPEC versus North America versus the Confederation of States, effectively Russia, Estonia, Latvia, those guys, and then other. The implication is, and why I'm kind of telling this story about scale, is again to get our minds around the scale of the economy of oil and natural gas, and then to put that in a perspective of global systems. It's a $2.1 trillion business on a yearly basis. So the oil markets are unimaginably large. And in fact, they're an order of magnitude larger from an economic sense than all of the metal work around the world. So all of the mining for gold, copper, iron ore, et cetera, globally. It's an order of magnitude larger. So this is a massive, massive industry. And again, to put that in a sense of scale, I'll just flip back to here real quick. The oil and natural gas world is here. The rest of our systems are up here. So it's an unimaginably large scale of business that we're dealing with. Wanted to take a moment and put a perspective on fuel efficiency and EV vehicles. So this is oil minus biodiesel demand. And what this shows is a perspective on, again, growth from 2020 out to 2050. This is provided again by ExxonMobil. And it shows how we use our crude oil. It's broken into residential and commercial use, chemicals, commercial transportation, et cetera. And up here is light vehicles. And so this shows the sensitivity that we were doing in industry of, well, what's going to go on with light vehicle demand? If we switch over to all electrical battery vehicles, what's that going to do? So if you take this line down to zero, and this to me is a reminder that we've got a whole lot of other work to do. This is good for the state of Kansas. Kansas is an oil and gas state, and I'm excited to be at the Petroleum Club. What this to me shows is that regardless of the highs and the lows on the sensitivity graph, we've got a lot of work to do in oil and gas exploration and development and production. Put another way, if you take light vehicle transportation and put it to zero, you still have one hell of a lot of oil and gas that you have to produce globally and nationally. There's an interesting wrinkle with Guyana production, and that is that the Guyanese government told us, look, ExxonMobil and your partners, you can come in here and do this, but we're a carbon negative country because of the Amazon rainforest. They're actually a carbon sink. And they said, so we need to develop our oil and natural gas, and we need to stay carbon negative. So you guys go figure out how to do that. Okay, that's tough. That's difficult to do. And so we had to go back to the engineering drawing board and figure out how do we do this and do it in a way that's going to maintain our access to the resource through the resource owners, through the Guyanese people. And so, that brings into the idea of the challenges and maybe the economic opportunities of carbon sequestration. In this case, in Guyana, we were thinking of it both from onshore sequestration, and we were also thinking of it in terms of offshore sequestration. How can we put CO2 under the ground and maybe use it in our reservoirs? How can we store it permanently underground in offshore or onshore resources? And is there a utility for it that we can use in industrial processes? The IRS 45Q tax credit. That creates an incentive not only for national producers offshore, but also for us onshore. And what it does is it creates a revenue stream for putting carbon dioxide under the ground, using that CO2. I'm very focused on it, and we're very focused on it at the Kansas Geological Survey because subsurface storage, subsurface sequestration is really the only pathway that you can take CO2 out of business. There are a couple of different mechanisms to do that. Number one, you can put it underground into spent oil fields and trap it there forever. And then the other way that you can do it, very compellingly, is you can use that CO2 to push molecules of oil and gas through the reservoir. And that's enhanced oil recovery, as many of you will know. So the enhanced oil recovery, there's also a tax credit for that in this. And so that $60 per ton becomes an incentive for us to take that gas, push it through oil and gas reservoirs, have an economic benefit, realize an economic benefit, while we're also increasing our oil field productivity. The scale of investment is challenging. The midstream connectivity, pipelines to get CO2, move it around. Do you do it by truck? Do you do it by pipeline? That's a challenge and something that we have to get our minds around. And then significantly, the regulatory timelines right now are unrealistic, and the costs to do the regulatory process are unrealistic. So those are the challenges, but there's also an economic opportunity, especially in the state of Kansas. I'm going to skip through these. This is just talking about the scale of the implications for global carbon capture from an economic perspective. But I want to talk about another foreign country, and this one is the state of Texas. So I should have said, is there anybody from Texas here? Okay, one. I'm sorry, but y'all, this is going to get rough for a minute here. So I want to talk just a minute and tell a story about Winter Storm Uri, and I know everybody here is familiar with that calamity. So just some stock photos that I pulled off the internet. This is New York Times article, shows in on, and it's going to do a time series through effectively all of Texas during that winter storm. And what makes it personal for me is I want to point out my house on each of these graphs. And I'm going to kind of keep going. There's my house. It's still out of power. And I think it was minus 15 outside. I mean, it was astonishingly cold. We had just come from Canada, so we were happy, but everybody else was pretty miserable. But by happy, it meant we were huddled around our gas fireplace because it was 30 degrees inside my living room. There's my house, it's still there. There's my house, still no power. Still no power. It's 3 days now, still no power. The result of that, and I don't know if audio is going to come through, but that's my kitchen. That's a rainstorm. We had 3 pipe bursts in my house. All but one people on my teams who lived in Texas had pipe bursts in their homes. It was catastrophic. And I don't think people really get a sense of that. It was really, truly a calamity. And that was from a few days of effectively the grid being down. So some conclusions. Even a very stable grid in the wealthiest nation on earth, and indeed the energy capital, I'm going to say Kansas can become the energy capital, but what was the energy capital of the United States, Houston, Texas, saw something around along the lines of about $300 billion of economic devastation through that. It was truly a calamity. The other conclusion that I have is just simply that Kansas is way better. So again, sorry Texans. Uri's a complex deal. Uri in Texas was a complex thing, but part of the equation and a very important part of the equation was that they were in a series of, and I'll show this graph actually. So this is a series of, it's a time series of coal plants that, or coal capacity that shows the initial operation and then when those operating facilities are scheduled to come offline. Now, I bring this in just as a way of saying that when we change our baseload capacity in electricity systems, we have to be very, very careful in doing that. Texas pulled off some of its coal burning power plants. They do that because they retire those plants because the costs and the cost expectations of operating them are less than the revenue required to retrofit or change those around. In this case, retrofitting and changing those plants into natural gas. But at the same time, they didn't weatherproof the systems. And so doing that haphazardly with a system that's not ready for very cold temperatures creates the problems. You have to weatherproof. You have to do these electrical transitions very, very carefully, and that was the lesson that we learned there. Talking about energy systems, so this is a tangle of a diagram, but I want to spend a little bit of time on it because I think it's a brilliant body of work. So this is coming from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And what they do, you can look this up on their website, and it's called their energy flow diagrams. But what they do is they take all of our energy systems, In this case, it's 97.3 quadrillion British thermal units, just means one hell of a lot of energy. And they disperse that into how much of our total energy system is petroleum, how much of it is biomass, coal, natural gas, geothermal, wind, hydro, nuclear, and solar. So they split it up into the sources of energy. In the middle of the diagram, it shows, in this case, BTUs, or you can think of it in percentages. And this is for, by the way, the United States, the whole U.S. In 2021. It shows how does that energy then get split up and divided into electrical energy generation, residential use, commercial use, industrial processes, so effectively heat for industrial processes, and then transportation. And I like to bring this into discussions, again, to underscore the point that it's a tangle. We have different electrical systems, we have different energy systems that go to different sectors, and a lot of times those are intermixing. It also is to underscore the point that petroleum products, largely oil, really goes dominantly to transportation. It goes also to industrial processes, mostly for lubes and as feedstock. But most of that petroleum goes to transportation systems. Natural gas goes to industrial processes. It also is split into, of course, residential and commercial heating and cooling, and then also into electrical generation. The others, geothermal, wind, hydro, nuclear, and solar, they're exclusively, effectively, going to electrical generation. Okay. The far right-hand side is also fascinating to me, at least. And what this goes to show is the amount of energy that is rejected or lost. Effectively, that's heat energy. And in any energy system, you're mostly going to dissipate with heat. Some of that is regrettable loss. Some of that is very necessary to keep systems cool. And so it shows the percentages. In this case, 67% of our energy portfolio is lost. It's never used. And 33% is actually used for the products that we make and doing what we need to do in our homes. So this Sankey diagram, again, is a different way to think about our whole portfolio and to think of the flow through and the intermixing of and the integration of our energy systems on our left-hand side, and then how they're used and how they're not used as we move to the right. Okay, I'm going to pivot that, the U.S. system again, and now here's the Kansas system. It's 2019. It's not quite in parity. The Lawrence Livermore analysis on a state-by-state basis doesn't quite keep track with their analysis for the U.S. In total. But what I think is fascinating is our petroleum usage, our utilization there, basically tracks what's going on in the greater United States. Our natural gas systems are more predominantly used in industrial processes, commercial and residential. There's less energy that comes from natural gas that goes into our electrical generation fleet, at least at 2019. And we have significantly larger proportion of our portfolio that's coming from, as a percentage, that's coming from wind, coming from nuclear, the Wolf Creek generation plant, and then finally solar. And of course, as you all know, those are growing sectors. So again, a Sankey diagram. This is a way to think about energy differentiation. I will note that we're on average with respect to the amount of energy that's lost. So that's kind of it's a regrettable loss, but it's not something right now that we can do much with. But I think that's a place where hydrogen can play. Oil and natural gas. We've always been an oil and natural gas state. I like to show this map. This is from my shop. And what this does is it shows and makes the point that the Hugoton gas field is super important. It was very important in the 2010s, as it has been throughout the history of oil and gas in our state. And then we have a number of different oil and gas trends. One of the things that is important in my mind is that we still have dry holes in the state. We still have oil and gas exploration and development that result in dry holes. And that's something that we're focused on because every dry hole is lost revenue, it's lost expense, and it's a lost opportunity. But I want to bring this back, and I want to think again about Kansas's electrical generation fleet, and what we're doing with, are we using our wind, our solar, our nuclear, our natural gas systems, are we using that as fully as we possibly can? And that then finally bridges into the concept of hydrogen. So I want to take a drink of water for a sec. And I'd like to start talking a little bit about hydrogen for industrial and economic growth. And the idea is this, and there's a cool little illustration that took me like hours to do, so I'll do it a couple of times because it's fun for me. But the idea is this, as many of us would have done in high school chemistry or college chemistry, you can take electrical energy, you can run it through two different wires in a glass of water, and one of those wires will generate oxygen from water, and one of those wires will generate hydrogen from water. So you'll get O2 and you'll get H2. There are different ways to make hydrogen. You can make hydrogen from natural gas through a reaction called pyrolysis. So there are lots of different pathways that we can use. But the one that is most common and most familiar to us is, again, taking electrical energy. There's a little bit of waste, and then you put it and you develop hydrogen from it. Here's the illustration part. There you go. I'm going to do it one more time. So you take that. Now, why is this important? How do we use that hydrogen? And why is it important from an electrical generation perspective? This is the Department of Energy's Swiss Army knife diagram, and I think it does an excellent job of explaining the hydrogen value chain and why it's potentially useful for us all. And the idea is simply this. So that electrical generation, the electrical grid, and the infrastructure needed to do that, you can use lots of different types of energy. And we are very plentiful in the state of Kansas in lots of different types of energy. You can use those different types of energy, from renewable energy sources to nuclear to coal to fossil fuels, and you can create electrical energy, as we all know. That electrical energy can go into the production through electrolysis of hydrogen. And that hydrogen can be used for a whole array of different utilizations. So it can be used to generate power back. So if you want to use that hydrogen, you can store it and use it later. So you can take that hydrogen and push it right back into the grid if you want to. Now, you wouldn't generate hydrogen just to be able to do that, because there's some heat loss and efficiency loss. So thermodynamically, that would be boneheaded. But the utility to be able to store energy is a good thing. And to be able to store energy in something that's not just a battery, which is expensive and heavy and requires really important minerals that are rare, that is something that's unique to hydrogen. The other things that are unique for hydrogen, so that's stored for use. The other thing that is notable about hydrogen is that the product itself can be used for heat, high heat sources in things like the manufacture of cement, the manufacture of steel, the manufacture of other heavy metals. Chemical and industrial processes all use hydrogen as a feedstock, both for power and also a feedstock as a chemical itself. The other thing that you can do, and this is the chemical part, you can make things like anhydrous ammonia, and I'll talk a little bit about anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous ammonia is incredibly important not only as a fertilizer for our large agricultural community, both as anhydrous but also derivative fertilizers, but it can also be used in energy systems. It can be transported. We know how to move ammonia around the country, either via truck or by pipeline. And so you can transport that, and you can crack that ammonia later again as energy, or use it as the chemical byproduct that it is. Metals production. Well, here, I'll switch over here. Same Swiss Army knife, but it's just going through the idea that you can use it also in refining processes. Hydrogen is used as a primary feedstock in refining to remove sulfur and to create other derivative products, things like aviation fuels. And you can do it, again, from a variety of different fuels, a variety of different energy production streams. Talked a little bit about ammonia fertilizer. This is a process called the Haber-Bosch process. It basically combines hydrogen with nitrogen, and you get NH3 in the back ends. You can also use hydrogen as a transportation fuel. I don't think that hydrogen is going to be used as a light transportation fuel anytime soon, but I do think that it can be something that can be used as part of our heavy truck fleet. For municipal vehicles, for buses, for garbage trucks and fire trucks, and for our heavy truck and freight. So this is an alternative, and it's a fuel that gives us optionality. Kansas, deep experience in wind power, as you all know. Of course, this is what modern wind looks like. And Kansas is, I think we get something on the order of, and I'll look to the chairman to correct me, on the order of something like 49% of our total electrical generation comes from wind. So we're well endowed in this resource. Fourth largest in the nation, second largest in terms of percentage of our electrical generation that comes from wind power. How can we use wind better? How can we use this resource better? Well, one way is we can proximally locate hydrogen production with our wind assets and use that wind to produce hydrogen. When you do that, again, you can use wind, which is inherently an intermittent energy source. Wind blows, you can produce energy. Wind doesn't blow, you can't produce energy. But you can take advantage of that intermittency and take better use of it when you are making hydrogen. I won't belabor the point to talk too much about solar irradiance or wind speed, but this is just a map to show the state of Kansas and not all wind turbines, but this is largely our wind generation fleet. We're well endowed in this resource across the state. When we think of the products that we can make, we have some regional infrastructural challenges. This is a map that I made of corn for grain. This is in bushels. And the impact of this map is that we have a significant amount of corn production throughout all sectors of the state of Kansas and in adjacent neighboring regions. But we're relatively far down the transport chain for things like anhydrous ammonia. It is relatively hard to get anhydrous to our producers, to our agricultural community. And so that's a need, and hydrogen can be one of the ways that we look at that. I would also say that anhydrous ammonia costs very closely track the cost of natural gas. And so we saw a really significant spike in the 2022 timeframe where we went from around $300 per metric ton for anhydrous, and it went up to something on the order of $1,600 per metric ton. So broadening our supply and creating a supply that's local to Kansas that can serve all of our needs is maybe something that we should be thinking about. Transportation fuels. So this is a map, same scale, and what this map shows is Kansas and Missouri and our surrounding states. And this is an artery map, and it shows the amount of the volume of heavy trucks, that's FAF trucks, per day that come through the I-35 and I-70 corridors, effectively linking Canada, Mexico, California, and the East Coast, California and New York, across our arteries. They come right through here. And so developing fuel systems that can link those systems is something that hydrogen can be a part of, either through fuel blending or through hydrogen itself. I'm not an expert on aviation fuel, but that's another place where we can be thinking about hydrogen development. Something unique about hydrogen is it's extremely expensive to store at the surface. It is inherently difficult to store at the surface and expensive. This is a liquid hydrogen fuel tank diagram, and if this looks like a tank from the space shuttle that's on its side, it's because that's exactly what it is. So this is rocket fuel. And you have to cool it if you're going to store it at the surface. You have to cool it into a liquid form in order to transport it around economically if you don't have a pipeline system. Pipeline systems are the next down. But again, surface storage becomes tricky, becomes expensive, and something that has to be taken into account. And thus comes the Kansas Geological Survey. We have, in the state of Kansas, the gift of very thick salt layers. Salt is an almost impermeable and very, very low porosity material. So as a geologist, I'm intrigued by salt. In this case, it's represented in, these are well logs. It's represented here in pink, where we have literally 500 feet thick stores of, in this case, the flower pot salt, and then closer to home here, the Hutchinson salt. That is effectively a porous and a very low porosity and impermeable material. Those salt deposits we think are going to be ideal for storage of hydrogen in our region. What would that look like? Well, that would look like the same types of salt storage caverns that were used to developing here. We've got a long history, 40 years or so, of development history of salt caverns. You wash fresh water down a well. That fresh water ultimately washes out the salt, and you create a purpose-made confined volume that you can control. That confined volume that we've used for decades for natural gas and for liquid hydrocarbons can also be used for gaseous hydrogen. And so we're investigating that as a far more economic way of storing hydrogen. This has been used for decades in the UK. It's being looked at for diapiric salt. But what I've argued to my colleagues around the nation is that Kansas's salt beds may be actually better for storing voluminous amounts of gases and hydrogen. So that's an asset that we have that we're looking to take advantage of and make this style of production far more economic. The other question that I get, and I'm nearing close here, but this is an important question. We have to be thinking about water, and we have to be thinking about, are we using a precious resource to develop something that's new, but something that's going to take our water away? These are maps that my colleagues at the Kansas Geological Survey have developed over years, and our biggest single program at the survey is measuring and understanding the water levels and the health and well-being of the sustainability of the High Plains Aquifer. And so this is the ugly orange. The red here is where, for irrigated agriculture, we've utilized that water, but the pumping rates are exceeding the recharge capacity of the reservoir. And so we're working with our agricultural community throughout the western and central parts of Kansas to ensure that we understand the volumes, we understand the rates of stability and the rates of decline in that aquifer. And then I've been incredibly impressed by all of our producers in how responsive they are to that and how they're working with us to ensure that they've got the right irrigation strategies. How does that play into hydrogen? Well, we can be smart about the ways that we're using our water, and we can be smart about how rapidly we're using that resource. This is a graph that we developed. This is a technique that we developed at the survey. And this shows the annual water level change on the y-axis, and it compares it to the annual water use. Okay, so use goes up, and the water level change, which is measured here in negative feet, it goes down. So what that means is we're using more water, and so you see the aquifer levels start to drop precipitously. There's a level there that we can measure called Q stable, and what that means is zero water level change in the aquifer. We want that or above for a sustainable aquifer. We ultimately want to fill back up the High Plains aquifer. And we know through measurement, through empirical data, we know for local areas what that Q stable equates to as far as water use. Again, a very tight data set, and so we can compare Q stable. That means that we're using here 328 acre feet in this area. This is the mean use that we're using right now, measured over multiple years in this area. So we're using 400, and that means that we're getting about 0.5 feet per year of water level change. That means that if we reduce by 19% in this area, we can achieve stability of the aquifer. We can achieve Q stable. How does this relate to hydrogen? When we go into areas, we can use this methodology, and we can say, you know what, we're going to purchase the water rights in this area that equate to Q stable, and we're simply not going to use 19% of that water. Okay, so you overpurchase. That's an economic burden, but you overpurchase the water, and then you scale back what you're actually going to use in your industrial process. And so we can play those two knobs together and achieve sustainable use of the aquifer for regions that we're operating in. There are other really nifty systems. We can reduce uranium contamination. We can reduce sulfate contamination in our aquifers as well by treating the water that we use as processed water. So there's a bunch of stuff that I am frankly excited to talk to you about when I come back for lunch sometime. About the water use in these types of systems. But what I will say is that we've got a path forward that allows us to be really the leader in how we do water, especially think about the central states in the western U.S. Some conclusions to wrap up, and I also promised Chairman Delperdang, almost called him Leo, that I'd talk to you all just a little about some of the cool stuff that we're doing to keep the bad guys from bringing drugs into the U.S. And so I've got just a quick screenshot of that because it's cool. But to conclude on the energy stuff, the world is really hungry for energy. The scale is absolutely unimaginable of the need. And we're rapidly moving and changing every year. Our energy poverty really presents major challenges for developing countries, for developing nations, and that has an impact on all of us here as well. Kansas is an energy state, and I believe that Kansas is an energy hub for the United States. We're central. We're well endowed with assets, and we should be using those for energy development and to lead the country in hydrogen development. Those energy resources are evolving. Hydrogen's a new opportunity. Kansas is way the hell better than Texas. We can take advantage of. Is this recorded? This is recorded, isn't it? Oh boy. Oops. One of the things that we need to be cognizant of is that it's our mature industries, our upstream infrastructure, our midstream infrastructure, our downstream infrastructure, the integration of our renewables fleet along with our hydrocarbon producing fleet that makes us so unique and makes this advantage come to us. I'm really excited about that integration, and on a day-by-day basis, I have as many conversations across the spectrum with oil and gas companies, with midstream entities, with offtake entities, as well as with renewable energy producers. And we need to protect and can protect our natural environment while we're doing it. So that's it for that. Do I have
Aaron,
2
Aaron
seconds?
will carry the mic for Q&A. If you'll just follow him, he'll show you where to go.
Sounds great.
One thing you didn't, thank you for the presentation. It's very, very interesting. I was listening to it all the time. And one thing you didn't bring up is that hydrogen has one very nasty characteristic. It's very dangerous.
Yes.
I mean, we had it going for a while. In 1938, Hindenburg blew up and boom, it's over.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's why it's expensive to store. That's why you can't use it in your house. Natural gas is bad enough. What is your proposal for taking out that danger? Because a truck with that amount of hydrogen for it to go across country is a bomb waiting to go off.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's spot on, and I think that's we're a very long way off from ever storing tankfuls of hydrogen in our gas tank. That is not the way that this is going to likely evolve. What we're talking about is industrial sites where you're cordoned off, you have a specific offset. Think of storage, for example. Our current storage facilities in the subsurface, very well vetted. They need to be very well vetted. Pressure needs to be monitored at all times, and so pressure monitoring becomes really important. Transportation via pipeline is very doable. We also transport right now hydrogen in refrigerated trucks on our highway systems all the time. So you're right, it is an explosive. We know how to handle hydrogen. We know how to keep it safe in pipelines. We know what happens to the metallurgy of steel if it's not the right composition of steel. So it's not like you can transport it through a typical steel pipeline that you're used to doing. You'll embrittle the steel. So I'd say we've got a long history with handling hydrogen. We have to continue to do so very, very carefully. Fuel cells will not end up looking like, it won't be a tank full of hydrogen. It'll be a hydrogen fuel cell. Fueling stations will largely look the same that they do today, but the safety systems and the pressure maintenance on those is something that has to be engineered very, very carefully. Yeah, it's not cheap. It's not cheap, and that all has to be taken into
One
account.
more question.
Where is China with regard to this technology that you talked about today?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I'm frankly ignorant on what the Chinese are doing right now in this space. I would say that the leaders right now, internationally speaking, are really in Europe. So UK, and then mainland Europe. Yep.
Let's do one more question. I shut it off, but I think we've got time for one more. Did you have a question, ma'am?
I was just wondering how is the pipeline situation? Are we going to have problems building necessary into the property rights of people who are against it? How is that going?
Yeah, so I think another really, really good question. The use of existing pipeline pathways wherever possible, that's going to be by far the cheapest way to do this. The reality is hydrogen is expensive to transport, and so proximity of hydrogen production to the offtakes, that's right now the way that we deal with hydrogen. It's effectively moved in pipelines along the Gulf Coast where there's an infrastructure for it, but largely hydrogen is moved around by truck cross country. And in regions. The pipeline infrastructure is something that we're looking at. How do we do that economically? But at the same time, our base case is effectively being very proximal to production and offtake. Yep.
Great.
It's a real challenge.
Round of applause for our speakers.
I would like to see Kansas become the energy supplier for the U.S. when it comes to hydrogen. Just stop and think just a minute what that would mean for Kansas. What would it mean for jobs? What's it mean for growth in here? And just what would it mean for revenue coming into the state? That's my kind of tax increase. Spread that base out and get a whole bunch more coming in, and it would benefit everybody. So in talking with Carl, we set up the date here to get the microphone, and we got to thinking a little bit more, and it's like, you know what? I can come up here and I could bend your ear for an hour on it, but right in our backyard, we've got somebody that's a whole bunch more knowledgeable on it than what I am. And I thought, why not? Let's see if we can get him down here. So reached out, and it just took a phone call. I have been working with this guy for a year and a half or so, I want to say, year and a half.